Abraham was skilled in all the sciences and continued to teach them to the sons of the freeborn, whence afterwards came the many learned priests and mathematicians who are known by the name of the Chaldean Magi. Afterwards, Abraham continued to propagate these sciences and arts when he came to Egypt, and found there, especially in Hermes, so apt a scholar, that the latter was at length called the Trismegistus of the sciences, for he was at the same time priest and natural philosopher in Egypt, and through him and a scholar of his the Egyptians received the first good laws and all the sciences in which Abraham had instructed him. Afterwards Euclid collected the principal sciences and called them geometry. But the Greeks and Romans called them altogether architecture. But in consequence of the confusion of languages, the laws and arts and sciences could not formally be propagated until the people had learned to make comprehensible by signs that which they could not understand by words. Wherefore, Mizraim, the son of Chem, brought the custom of making himself understood by signs with him into Egypt when he colonized a valley of the Nile. This art was afterwards extended into all distant lands, but only the signs that are given by the hands have remained in architecture, for the signs by figures are as yet known to but few. In Egypt, the overflowings of the Nile afforded an opportunity to use the art of measurement, which had been introduced by Mizraim, and to build bridges and walls as a protection against the water. They used burnt stone and wood and earth for these purposes. Therefore, when the heathen kings had become acquainted with this, they were compelled to prepare stone and lime and bricks, and therewith to erect buildings, by which, through God's will, however, they became only the more experienced artists, and were so celebrated that their art spread as far as Persia. If the reader compares this legend of the Kraus manuscript with that which is given by Dr. Anderson in the first edition of his Constitutions, he will be constrained to admit that both documents are derived from the same source, or that one of them is an abridged or an expository copy of the other. It is evident that the statement in Anderson is merely a synopsis of that more detailed narrative contained in the Kraus legend, or that it is an expansion of the statement in the first edition of the Constitutions. If the Kraus manuscript was written before Anderson compiled his history, it could not have been long anterior, and must have been composed between 1714, the date of the Papworth manuscript, which contains the legend in its medieval form, and 1723, when Anderson published his work. Within this period, the Masons sought to modify the old legend of the craft so as to deprive it of its apparent absurdities, and to omit its anachronisms so as to give it the appearance of an authentic historical narrative. Instead, therefore, of having the date of 926, which has been ascribed to it by Dr. Kraus, his manuscript is, as Brother Hugon thinks it, a compilation of the early part of the last century. It is, however, important, as I have said, because it shows how the old legend was improved and divested of its anachronisms. It is certainly a very absurd anachronism to make Euclid the contemporary of Abraham, who lived more than 2,000 years before him. Nor is it less absurd to suppose that Euclid invented Masonry in Egypt, whence it was carried to India and practiced by King Solomon, since the great geometrician did not flourish until 6 centuries and a half after the construction of the temple. Considered, then, as an historical narrative, the legend of Euclid is a failure, and yet it has its value as the symbolical development of certain historical facts. The prominent points in this legend being, of course, those on which the old believers of it most strenuously dwelt are: 1. That geometry is the groundwork of Masonry. 2. That Euclid was the most distinguished of all geometricians. And 3. That the esoteric method of teaching this, as well as all the other sciences, which was pursued by the priests of Egypt, was very analogous to that which was adopted by the operative Masons of the Middle Ages in imparting to their disciples the geometric and architectural secrets which constituted what they called the mystery of the craft. The legend, in fact, symbolizes the well-recognized fact that in Egypt, in early times, of which there is no historical objection to make Abraham the contemporary, there was a very intimate connection between the science of geometry and the religious system of the Egyptians. That this religious system embraced also all scientific instruction, that this instruction was secret and communicated only after an initiation. Footnote. Kendrick confirms this statement in his Ancient Egypt, where he says, "When we read of foreigners in Egypt being obliged to submit to painful and tedious ceremonies of initiation, it was not that they might learn the secret meaning of the rites of Osiris or Isis, but that they might partake of the knowledge of astronomy, physics, geometry, theology." Volume 1, page 383. And that in that way there was a striking analogy between the Egyptian system and that of the medieval Masons. And this fact of an analogy, the latter sought to embody in the apparent form of an historical narrative, but really in the spirit of a symbolic picture. Thus considered, the legend of the craft, in its episode of Euclid, and his marvelous doings in the land of Egypt, is divested of its absurdity, and it is brought somewhat nearer to the limits of historical verity than the too literal reader be disposed to admit.